is really central to the way that a scripture is lived out by a religious community, because any scripture needs interpretation, in fact, to provide meaning for the community, and interpretation is necessarily linked with authority and power. So these are quite complicated things which we don't want to sort of present simplistically or with truisms or generalities. Now, in Sunni Islam, there's a robust tradition of interpretation of the Quran, which has different currents in different schools, but there's no centralized authority. So if we take a simple example such as in Quran chapter 17, verse 1, we have an allusion to some sort of an experience that a servant of God had, which took him from a place called the Holy Mosque to a place called the Furthest Mosque. That's all the Quran says. It says it took place by night as well, so I should add that. Islamic tradition develops two strands of interpretations about this passage. One is that it's a story about the Prophet Muhammad, who really physically traveled from the city of Mecca to the city of Jerusalem in a miraculous event on a winged animal, an animal with wings, who even gets a name. It's al-Buraq. Right? So that's one interpretation. And the other interpretation is, yes, it is about the Prophet Muhammad, but it was about some sort of mystical, spiritual experience, an out-of-body experience, in which he mystically traveled to Jerusalem and saw the city, but his body remained in Mecca. So these two interpretations are just left to remain there, and Sunni Islam has no authoritative body or magisterium, if we use the Catholic example, in which to say this is the proper way to read Quran chapter 17, verse 1. Now, in Shia Islam, we find that there are certain structures which distinguish Shia Islam from Sunni Islam, because there are certain titles which authoritative teachers receive when they're recognized by the community of having achieved a certain degree of learning. So you become what's called a Hujjatullah, and then an Ayatollah, or Ayatollah as it's commonly pronounced, and then finally a Grand Ayatollah. And those figures such as Sistani, the Iranian cleric who's in Najaf, Iraq, have the ability to influence a large body of the community simply by offering their own interpretation of the text. So it lends a little bit more coherence to the community's interaction with the scripture. Well, there's certainly parallels between that can be drawn between Shia Islam and Catholicism in particular. And I think with Sunni Islam and with Protestantism, again, I do this with some trepidation because you don't want to simplify or oversimplify. But it is interesting to note that Shia Islam basically embraces a rational approach to Islamic theology. In other words, they place a high degree of trust in human reason and have a conviction that humans, generally the Shia position is that humans have free will, that humans are able to interpret metaphorically or symbolically certain elements of the Quran which may seem from a literal reading to be in tension with reason. This is a little bit vague and ambiguous, I realize. But and there's that can exist also in Sunni Islam, but it's more central to Shia Islam. And of course, that's something we find in the Catholic tradition, especially with the centrality of the thought of Thomas Aquinas, which is highly influenced, of course, by philosophy, Aristotelian philosophy in particular, in which encourages a high degree of rational reflection in our engagement with the Bible, with Scripture, and with tradition. And so, again, we don't want to generalize, but especially those strands of Protestantism like the Reformed tradition, which have a very high place for the authority of Scripture, there's some connections that can be drawn with the majority tradition of Sunni Islam. So I do think, it can be fruitful to think in those ways.